Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Wyoming. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the late autumn of 1879, a storm was rolling over the southern ridges of the Wind River Range. The wind carried a metallic taste, the kind miners often said meant change, or worse. On the outskirts of South Pass City, a small mining camp known as Ravens Hollow had been operating for nearly a decade. The site wasn't on most maps, and for good reason. The mine there was privately run, its ownership tangled between missing investors and expired claims. What little remains of its name survives in county records from Fremont County, a penciled entry beside Silver Extraction License number 184. The records mention 12 men. Their names, now faded from history, appear again in a torn payroll ledger retrieved years later. Harlan, McGill, the two Baker brothers, a cook called Sutter, and 7 others with only initials. What united them wasn't kinship, but debt. All had signed on for what they were told would be a 6-month contract extracting silver ore from a newly discovered vein. The foreman, a man named Elias Dorn, had worked briefly in the larger camps near South Pass City, a real boomtown known for its short-lived silver rush. Historians of the period often mention South Pass City's unpredictable mines. Some were rich with promise, others filled with gas and silence. When a prospector named William Price stopped by the Ravens Hollow site in October of that year, he described it in his travel notes: a hole in the world, lit by one lantern, and the sound of hammers beneath the ground. No laughter, no noise, save for the pick. By December, snowfall had sealed the road, and supply wagons couldn't reach the site, and nearby settlements assumed the miners had wintered underground, as some operations did. But when the thaw came in March of 1880, a survey crew passing through found the camp deserted. The cooking area was half buried in ash. Inside the main shaft, a section of tunnel had collapsed inward, the timber supports broken clean through. The county constable's report, filed weeks later, describes what he saw with clinical restraint: bodies interred by force of earth, limbs entwined, faces preserved as if caught in fright. The deeper air was foul, yet dry, as though time itself avoided the place. Newspapers in Laramie and Cheyenne ran short notices. None mentioned the mine by name. One column referred to it as the Silent Hill. Another speculated the collapse was deliberate, a closing of accounts. And yet, despite the report, there's evidence that someone, or several, had returned after the disaster. A torn scrap of paper, found near the foreman's quarters, carried a single line written in charcoal: "The silver is still breathing." To this day, no official record lists who retrieved the bodies or if all 12 were ever found. Some later writings, a letter from a Fremont County surveyor in 1886, claimed the shaft was resealed under instruction from territorial authorities, but there's no further mention of who gave that order. By midsummer of 1880, Ravens Hollow was already fading from public memory. The story should have ended there, a tragic but ordinary mine collapse. Yet the more the county clerks tried to close the file, the stranger the entries became. In June, a claim renewal request appeared under the same mining license number 184, signed in the same hand as before: E. Dorn. The problem was, Elias Dorn was listed among the dead. A local paper out of Green River Station printed a single paragraph under odd correspondence, noting that a man claiming to be Mr. Dorn had attempted to withdraw the rights to the property. When a deputy clerk asked him to provide proof of identity, the man vanished before morning. The handwriting on the form matched older receipts from the camp precisely: the same looping D, the same downward slash in his signature. That document was quietly filed away, marked "Invalid, Possible Fraud," and forgotten. Folklore later grew around this moment. Some said it was Dorn himself, dug free from the rubble and half mad. Others believed a surviving miner forged the name to sell off what silver remained. The truth may lie somewhere in between. In the archives of the Wyoming Territorial Survey, a report dated late 1880 makes passing mention of a restricted shaft east of South Pass City. It describes a large depression in the ground, timber fragments protruding like ribs, and a hollow tone beneath one's feet when walking near the edge. This was about 8 miles from the historical silver veins that made South Pass City briefly prosperous in the 1870s. The site wasn't officially mapped again until decades later. Eyewitness accounts from nearby homesteads add another layer. A rancher named Martha Tilden wrote to her cousin in Nebraska that same year, "At night we see a glow from the ridge, not fire, but like lanterns under the soil. The dogs will not go near." The sheriff at the time, Nathaniel Coe, sent 2 men to investigate in July. Their written statement is brief and uneasy. Ground loose, echoing hollows below, one shaft sealed by boards nailed from within. We left before sundown. No further action was taken. The region was sparsely populated, and after the mining bust of the late 1870s, most prospectors had moved north toward Montana. By 1881, Ravens Hollow was a ghost slope, its trails erased by wind and rain. Still in letters preserved at the State Archive, an engineer named R.F. Callahan references the Hollow Mine case, comparing it to the collapses near South Pass City, which were known to produce sudden subsidence due to unstable rock and abandoned tunnels. Callahan's tone was practical, even dismissive, but he acknowledged one detail that stood out. In the hollow site, no sign of explosive gas, no floodwater, no trace of natural cave-in, only a deliberate break in the beams, by hand or tool. A deliberate collapse, not an accident. Yet no motive was ever recorded. The payroll ledger from the site ended abruptly, the last entry dated October 31, 1879. The next page was scorched, as if by a candle left too long near the paper. Beside it, in faint ink, 12 down, 11 known. The meaning of that line was never explained. In the months that followed, the name Ravens Hollow began to circulate quietly in neighboring towns, not in official reports, but in taverns and mail depots. Men who claimed to have worked there spoke of the sound that came from the stone. Others said the mine had been cursed since its first strike, when a mule died instantly from inhaling the dust that rose from the pit. Among the surviving fragments of correspondence from that winter, one letter stands out. It's addressed to a Dr. Hiram Leland of Rawlins, a physician known for his studies of mining-related lung disease. The unsigned writer described a humming below the rock, increasing each night until we could not sleep, and pleaded for advice on whether vibrations from trapped gas could resemble human voices. The letter was never answered, but the envelope was stamped from Atlantic City, Wyoming, a real settlement just miles from South Pass City, known then for its small but persistent silver operations. This connection to South Pass City became part of the case's legacy. The old mining boom there had seen hundreds of claims abandoned overnight when shafts proved too unstable or when ore veins ran dry. Historical records of that area, especially from 1870 to 1880, describe multiple cave-ins, though few with survivors. It's believed that whoever wrote to Dr. Leland had once worked under Dorn, or perhaps escaped before the final collapse. In early 1881, a geologist named Thomas Redden was hired by the county to inspect several derelict sites, Ravens Hollow among them. His field notes, preserved in the Fremont County Archive, are written in a detached tone, yet something in his observations hints at unease. Signs of deliberate structural tampering, main beam fractured not by pressure, but with instrument. No attempt to retrieve equipment. All personal effects left in quarters, undisturbed. A small drawer. Null burned except final page. We heard them beneath. Redden sealed the shaft permanently, ordering local workers to fill it with gravel and soil. He filed one final report stating that the mine presents a persistent echo, though source indeterminate. When asked years later, he denied hearing anything unusual, claiming his assistant exaggerated. Still, in his private journal, found after his death in 1894, one entry contradicts that. No man could bear that sound, as though the earth itself were exhaling. The coroner's review, brief as it was, made no mention of recovered remains beyond 4 partially preserved bodies. Each was identified only by clothing fragments. 2 of the 12 had gold-rimmed buttons. Miners rarely afforded such detail. That discrepancy troubled the clerk who signed off the record. Whoever funded this, he noted, paid them more than miners earn. By 1882, the mine was erased from official maps. But a handful of miners heading north toward South Pass City carried fragments of the story, saying that Dorn's camp had been built atop an earlier, unrecorded tunnel, perhaps from Spanish explorers or trappers long before Wyoming was a territory. No proof ever surfaced, yet the rumor took root. The strange thing was that every mention of the hollow seemed to vanish soon after it appeared. Newspaper clippings went missing, survey notes misfiled. Even Redden's reports were found in an envelope labeled simply, "Abandoned property, unfit for entry." It was as if the earth wasn't the only thing swallowing the mine. Something else was helping it disappear. In 1883, nearly 4 years after the disaster, a group of new settlers from Illinois built small cabins on the southern edge of the abandoned valley. Among them was Caleb Merrin, a blacksmith who later testified in the county court regarding unsettling disturbances near the site. His affidavit, though brief, was preserved in the territorial archives under the heading Noise Complaints, Silver District. He described hearing a low, grinding hum during the evenings, which ceased abruptly whenever anyone approached the ridge. He also mentioned finding tools, iron picks and shovels, half buried in the thawing mud, their handles brittle and dry, as if aged beyond their time. Merrin's young son, Thomas, later told a traveling reporter from the Cheyenne Daily Leader that he had seen light flicker from inside the ground, like lanterns below the dirt. The article ran under a single line, "The mine that wouldn't rest." Around this time, a territorial engineer revisited several of the mining claims surrounding South Pass City for reevaluation. His report, which referenced the nearby hollow site indirectly, noted that several older shafts in the area shared a peculiar feature: ventilation tunnels that didn't match the main diggings, as though someone had carved secondary passages long before the mines were officially registered. The engineer, Henry Stillman, speculated that these might have been remnants from earlier exploratory expeditions in the region, perhaps dating back to the 1850s. Stillman referenced South Pass City in his notes, describing it as an emblem of both prosperity and grave danger to the careless prospector. What unsettled Stillman most wasn't the age of the tunnels, but the marks he found near the sealed shaft at Raven's Hollow. The boards had shifted slightly, pushed outward from inside, though no sign of tampering from above could be detected. "It is my belief," he wrote, "that some cavity below the surface continues to settle or move. The soil around the vent is dry and oddly warm to the touch." When he returned weeks later to take measurements, the boards were gone. The next entry in the county docket is dated August 1883, the disappearance of a local peddler named Isaac Roon, last seen taking a shortcut through the same valley. His horse was found grazing near a creek, his cart overturned, and several silver ore samples scattered in the grass. Roon was never located. The sheriff, Nathaniel Coe, wrote the briefest note of his career. Ground gave way. No further search advised. By 1884, settlers began abandoning the area. Their letters, collected decades later by a local historian, mention the valley's hum, voices from the frozen ridge, and shadows that lingered when light was gone. None of it was corroborated, yet the cumulative pattern was impossible to ignore. A missionary passing through in winter wrote that his horses refused to cross the ravine near the mine. It was, he wrote, as if the air there had a weight not found elsewhere. When the Wyoming Territory formally entered its final decade before statehood, the Ravens Hollow incident was no longer considered tragedy or cautionary tale. It had become a warning, whispered to any man seeking fortune in the rock. By the spring of 1885, Ravens Hollow had returned to near-complete silence. The few who passed through the region spoke of toppled timbers, broken shacks, and the faint outline of the sealed shaft, covered now by moss and wind-blown soil. But that year, a strange detail surfaced in the territorial courthouse, a bill of sale for 12 mining lamps purchased under the name E. Dorn Associates. The date, April 14, 1885. The receipt bore a faded seal from the hardware store in Lander, nearly 60 miles away. When the shopkeeper, Rufus Albee, was questioned years later, he recalled the buyer clearly. A man with a burned complexion, quiet voice, and a left hand that seemed to tremble when he wrote. He remembered it only because the man refused change, leaving several dollars extra for the inconvenience of haste. Albee's testimony resurfaced decades later in an inquiry by a historian named Clara Winthrop, who studied forgotten mining accidents of Wyoming. Her notes compared the handwriting on that 1885 receipt with the 1879 payroll ledger. Both matched the style of Elias Dorn. Whether Dorn had survived or someone was carrying his name, no one could prove. But the timing unnerved those few who remembered the collapse. 6 years after the mine had entombed its crew, someone was purchasing lamps, as if ready to go below again. Later that same year, a shepherd traveling from the Sweetwater Plains claimed he saw lamplight deep within the hollow. His statement, recorded by a circuit judge, reads like a confession. The light was steady, not flickering, as if a man held it still. I called out, no answer, yet the glow receded deeper, then vanished straight down. The judge, Everett Shaw, dismissed it as imagination brought on by exhaustion. Still, he noted in the margin of his docket, witness appeared sober. Voice shook only when he spoke of the sound. It was round this time that the name Raven's Hollow vanished from official reference altogether. Later surveys simply called it Plot 39. A faint pencil annotation in the Fremont County Register reads, "No entry, unfit for labor." Yet one surviving sketch from around this period shows something rarely noted before. 3 shafts, not one. The 2 smaller ones had been filled in, but a third, narrow pit appeared newly cut. It led not toward the old vein, but directly beneath the workers' quarters, as if someone had begun tunneling down from the living quarters rather than toward the silver lode. That diagram, preserved in the archives beside the name of Thomas Redden, the geologist who first inspected the site, contained a single side note in his own handwriting. New chamber discovered beneath quarters, not of recent construction. No further pages follow. Redden's field book ends abruptly, mid-sentence. Folklore from the nearby settlements began to call the site the Mouth, suggesting that the mine wasn't merely dug, but opened. By 1886, shepherds refused to graze their flocks there, claiming the ground sighed during the night. Still, no official reports were filed. Wyoming was growing toward statehood, and its officials were eager to forget the remnants of ghost camps that might taint their new reputation. Yet, as history shows, buried things have a way of returning, sometimes in the most literal sense. In the winter of 1886, a traveling photographer named Samuel Coates passed through the southern trails leading toward South Pass City. His surviving photographs, recovered decades later, include a single damaged plate labeled Camp Near the Hollow. The image, though faint and corroded, shows the collapsed remnants of 2 shanties and a black opening in the slope, almost swallowed by snow. Around it, faint silhouettes of what appear to be tools or perhaps wooden posts lean outward, distorted by exposure. Coates wrote a few notes on the back of his field diary. Area near ridge yields no sound, yet camera catches haze when plate is wet. Locals refuse to assist, citing old stories of voices below. That same year, in a short column from the Laramie Sentinel, an editor recounted what he called the Whisper Mine of Fremont. He cited unnamed sources claiming that government agents had visited the hollow under orders from the territorial governor to assess potential reactivation of the silver vein. The article vanished from subsequent printings, replaced days later by an unrelated notice about livestock. Within months, correspondence from the Wyoming Geological Office mentions that certain exploratory evaluations were suspended due to instability of terrain and incomplete property ownership. The letter never names the site, but refers specifically to a 3-shaft configuration, a detail known only from Redden's lost field book. Around that time, rancher Martha Tilden, whose earlier letters had described the strange lights, was interviewed by a regional historian, and her comments remain among the last first-hand testimonies from the 1880s. We heard tapping beneath frost, once, twice, then nothing. My husband swore it was just rock settling, but I knew the rhythm of a man's tool. It had pause and purpose. Her words reappear later in the Wyoming Gazetteer of Lost Sea, Tillmans, published 1892, in a section summarizing unconfirmed mining tragedies. The editor drew comparison to the real-life incidents in South Pass City, where unstable ore veins and amateur reinforcements had caused frequent collapses during the early rush years. He wrote that the hollow, if ever reopened, might reveal older workings, predating our known history of the place. By 1887, the last recorded visitor to the area was a prospector named Eli Barlow, who noted odd warmth in the frozen soil and stone that hums faintly when struck. Barlow's pickaxe and mule harness were found 2 weeks later beside a frozen stream. The search party never located his body, but they recovered a torn scrap of paper from his satchel that read, "Heard knocking below, thought it was wind, then realized it answered me." For decades, these accounts circulated quietly, folded into the larger fabric of frontier superstition. But among mining families in Wyoming, one saying lingered, "Don't dig where the hollow breathes." The strange consistency between testimonies, sounds, warmth, light, suggests something geological, perhaps even explainable. Yet, to those who lived near the ridge, logic offered little comfort. They said the mine never closed. Not really. It simply changed the direction of its digging. And in one final note found in a weathered surveyor's sketchbook from 1888, a line in faint graphite seems to confirm that fear. New fissure forming above old shaft. Something moving below. By 1888, the territorial capital in Cheyenne had all but forgotten Ravens Hollow. Yet that same year, a brief notice appeared in the Rock Springs Miner reporting that a party of engineers had surveyed an unrecorded mining site near the Sweetwater River, believed to contain traces of silver and zinc. The coordinates matched the hollow's valley almost precisely. No official names were listed, but one of the signatures on the accompanying freight order was E. Dorn. The handwriting again matched the earlier ledgers. Local rumor held that 2 of the engineers never returned. Their camp equipment was discovered days later by trappers, undisturbed, meals half prepared, and the tent ropes still fastened. No bodies were recovered. The newspaper ran no follow-up. A month later, a Cheyenne freight operator, Miles Radner, reported transporting timbers and lime barrels to a location east of South Pass City, paid in full by a private syndicate who provided no company name. According to his later affidavit, the men who met him there wore miners' coats but carried no tools. One, he said, spoke little and kept staring at the mouth of the earth as if expecting something to answer. It was during this same period that a traveling preacher, Reverend Amos Bird, mentioned Ravens Hollow in a sermon delivered in Lander. His words, printed in a local church bulletin, capture the tone of dread that had settled over the district. There are places where men dig not for ore, but for proof that the grave has a second mouth. The congregation thought it metaphorical, yet in private letters Bird claimed to have visited the ridge himself. In those pages he described an uncanny draft, warm though the snow stood 3 feet thick, rising as if the ground below were breathing. In March of that same year, a snowstorm swept through the region, burying the old paths entirely. When the Edu came, one of the new shafts, cut in 1885, had collapsed inward. From the exposed soil protruded the remains of a wooden ladder and a cracked iron lamp. County officials ordered the site condemned. A new record appeared in 1889, assigning ownership of the land to the Wyoming Territorial Mining Office, but with the note, "Property dormant, access prohibited." For years afterward, shepherds avoided the valley, yet stories persisted. In the taverns of South Pass City, miners whispered about a deep hum that carried across still nights. Some claimed it was air moving through old shafts. Others insisted it sounded like voices far below, repeating the same rhythm, 3 short, 1 long, like the pattern of a miner's hammer. Around 1890, One final government report referenced the hollow indirectly. Its author, Professor Henry Stillman, who had earlier surveyed the site, warned that the soil composition and gas retention in the region were unlike any other found in the state, and suggested all nearby claims be sealed permanently. Stillman compared the hollow's geology to the fissures once mapped near South Pass City, noting that certain subterranean chambers there had acoustic anomalies that could mimic the sound of movement or human labor. Stillman's observation was meant as science, but for the dwindling settlers of the region, it only reinforced their fear that the mine still worked itself, unseen and eternal. And one final line from Stillman's private journal, later found among his effects, seems to suggest that even he was unsure of what he heard that night. At dusk, faint tapping resumed. I counted 12 strikes. The new decade brought the promise of stability to Wyoming, yet the hollow refused to rest. By 1891, a growing number of prospectors were returning to the Sweetwater Basin, lured by old tales of untapped veins and forgotten claims. Among them was a young engineer named James Corbett, who would later become a minor figure in the Territorial Geological Office. His journal from that year, recovered after his death, contains the most detailed surviving description of Raven's Hollow before it disappeared for good. Corbett's notes begin plainly, a man of reason, charting soil layers and mineral density, but by the third entry his tone shifts. He writes of a constant resonance, felt rather than heard, and small vibrations that disturbed the compass needle though no magnetite was present. He describes lowering a candle into a narrow crevice, watching it flicker sideways as if caught in a current flowing upward. When he attempted to measure the depth of the sealed shaft, his line reached 90 feet before striking a hollow space that returned a deep echo. As if something vast and open lay below, he wrote. He sketched it roughly, an immense chamber, perhaps natural, perhaps carved. He marked its probable center with a circle and a single word beside it, breath. What unsettled Corbett most wasn't the echo, but the faint metallic scent that rose from it, not rot or gas, but something like wet coin. He left the site abruptly, claiming he would return with equipment. He never did. His journal ends with the line, "The ground moves with memory." The following spring, heavy rains triggered multiple landslides along the ridge, wiping out what little remained of the hollow's upper entrance. Ranchers reported hearing thunder underground days before the collapse, and several claimed to see thin smoke or steam rising from fissures in the soil. The county, eager to prevent panic or unwanted curiosity, issued a single official statement calling it a seasonal subsidence typical of exhausted terrain. Yet letters from nearby settlers tell a different story. One from a widow named Ellen Voss reads, "The night the earth sank, the cattle bawled as if they smelled something burning below. By morning the valley floor had changed shape, smoother, lower, and colder." By 1893, the hollow was effectively erased. No road signs, no mention in the new maps printed after Wyoming's statehood. When surveyors returned to document the Sweetwater region, they found only a broad depression filled with silt and scattered timbers. One of them, Joseph Hayne, later wrote in a private letter, "You can still hear it, faintly, when the wind settles and the soil is damp, a pulse, like the draw of a bellows. I would not camp there again." Meanwhile, in the archives of the Wyoming Historical Society, a memorandum from that same year reveals a curious footnote. Certain geological samples from the South Pass vicinity exhibit low-grade silver traces in newly formed clay layers, possible upward displacement. In other words, the earth itself was pushing fragments of the mine, and perhaps its story, back toward the surface. By 1894, the hollow had taken on the weight of legend. Miners in Lander referred to it only as the Breath Pit. No one could pinpoint its exact location anymore, yet everyone agreed it was somewhere west of the old South Pass line. It was around this time that a local teacher, Mrs. Lydia Grant, collected several oral accounts from the few remaining settlers who still remembered the collapse. Her handwritten manuscript, Echoes of the Wyoming Hills, remains one of the most revealing glimpses into how folklore and record began to blur. Grant interviewed 11 residents, many elderly, all with varying recollections of the Ravens Hollow disaster. One man, Jonas Pike, claimed his father had helped seal the shaft in 1880. He described how the boards groaned when nailed down, as if the air beneath were pushing back. Another recalled a rumor that the mine had been built over a cavern known to the Shoshone people, avoided for generations due to restless ground. Grant's most chilling entry concerns a miner's widow named Margaret Dorn, who identified herself as the foreman's sister. According to Grant's notes, Margaret refused to discuss her brother's death, but admitted to receiving 2 letters from him postmarked months after the collapse, both written in a trembling hand. The first was dated March 1880, and the second October 1885. She destroyed them after reading. When asked why, she answered, "Because he signed them both with my husband's name." Grant, skeptical yet thorough, added a margin note. Tone of the statement calm, not hysterical. Around that same year, the local rail expansion uncovered new mineral deposits west of South Pass City. Surveyors sent teams to investigate, one of which, led by Captain R.F. Callahan, formerly of the Territorial Engineers, reported hearing subsurface resonance of unknown origin. Callahan, who had once reviewed the hollow case himself, noted that the tone of the sound matched earlier descriptions from the 1880s, but now seemed muffled, distant, as if separated by great depth. He wrote, "The sound is constant when instruments are lowered, yet vanishes entirely once withdrawn. The men dislike it, saying it feels as though something is listening back." That report was never officially filed. It survives only as a private carbon copy found among Callahan's effects after his death in 1898. Meanwhile, in the town of Lander, newspaper editor Henry Welch published a brief editorial titled "The Mines That Remember." In it, he mentioned South Pass City's silver veins and the hollow in the same breath, remarking that perhaps some things buried in this earth were meant to stay so. He received anonymous letters afterward, a few praising the peace, one accusing him of tempting the silence. By the end of the decade, Ravens Hollow existed only in faint recollection, its name absent from state registers, its coordinates erased by deliberate omission. But for those few who lived within a day's ride, its presence lingered like a breath behind the hills. And on some nights, when wind scraped across the valley's edge, they swore they could still hear the rhythm of picks beneath the ground, steady, patient, and unending. The turn of the century brought change to Wyoming. Railroads, new towns, the steady pulse of progress. Yet in the quiet between those forward steps, the hollow's legend refused to fade. In 1901, a small expedition funded by a Cheyenne mining syndicate returned to survey the Sweetwater region for possible reclamation. They brought with them new equipment, electric lamps, and a geological consultant named Dr. Hiram Leland, Jr., son of the same physician once contacted about the strange humming in the 1870s. Dr. Leland's diary, discovered years later among his papers, gives us a rare first-hand look at what remained of Ravens Hollow after 20 years buried under soil in silence. He described the journey through the ridge country as eerily soundless, even the birds unwilling to cross the air above it. When his team finally located the depression once marked on older maps, they found the faint ring of a circular indentation, and beneath it, when probed with steel rods, hollow space. On the second day they broke through. The entry shaft had shifted from the earlier sketches. It was narrower, irregular, as if the earth itself had drawn a mouth around its edges. The men descended 30 feet before reaching a layer of fine gray dust that smelled faintly metallic. Beneath it were fragments of timber and what appeared to be bones, though Dr. Leland's notes described them as calcined, brittle, and hollow, like the inside of reeds. Among the debris lay several objects that matched accounts from the original collapse: a rusted pickaxe, a cracked lantern lens, a section of boot sole still holding its nails. Leland wrote, "It seems unlikely so little wood would survive if this had truly been a cave-in. The manner of destruction feels deliberate, not accidental. The shafts here do not radiate outward as normal excavations, but spiral downward." He compared the design to certain exploratory shafts near South Pass City, noting that those too showed signs of older, undocumented construction, possibly from trappers or forgotten expeditions. Still, he admitted this spiral formation was unlike any known mining technique. On the third night, the crew refused to continue. 2 men reported hearing faint knocking below the shaft floor. Another swore he heard breathing in the pauses between strikes. Dr. Leland dismissed it as imagination amplified by the wind through fissures, yet his later notes contradict that calm logic. The rhythm is too precise, like a man calling from beneath stone. When they returned to Lander a week later, the syndicate disbanded quietly. No report was filed. Leland's private conclusion, written on the final page of his field journal, is perhaps the most disturbing sentence ever attached to the case. If the records of 1879 speak truth, then something beneath that hill has never ceased its labor. He never revisited the site. Within months, heavy rains swept the ridge again, and any trace of their work was gone. In a letter to a colleague, Leland later referenced the real mines near South Pass City, noting that the echoes of those collapsed chambers may outlast the men who made them. But he added a curious line beneath his signature, almost an afterthought. The hollow is not echo. It is answer. In the years that followed, the hollow slipped further into the margins of memory, yet never fully disappeared. The territory became a state. Rail lines cut through the plains, and new mines opened across the region. But local ranchers near the Sweetwater Basin continued to speak of a dead hum that rose from the ridge during cold months, a tone that rattled crockery and frightened horses. By 1903, a new property map placed that same ridge under private ownership, marked to a small firm called Wyoming Silver Coal Comb. The company's records, now lost except for a single ledger entry, list only one shipment from the property. 12 crates, geological specimens. No weight, no recipient, no transport details. The entry was signed in faint ink by an H. Stillman, likely a clerk or relative of Professor Henry Stillman, who had surveyed the region years earlier. In February 1904, a small newspaper from Rawlins reported that a train carrying several sealed crates from Lander derailed near Green River Station. Most cargo was recovered. 2 crates, however, were never accounted for. The article ends with a curious note. Witnesses described a strong metallic odor near the site, though no ore was present. A month later, Dr. Leland Jr. wrote his final known letter, addressed to a colleague in Denver. He mentioned returning to the hollow one last time, to close a matter that has lingered too long. His handwriting was unsteady, his tone fatalistic. The letter ends mid-sentence. He was never heard from again. County records indicate a Dr. H. Leland was listed among those missing during a spring storm in 1904. His carriage was found near the Sweetwater Crossing, wheels half buried in mud, medical case still intact. No trace of the man himself. Folklore grew fast after that. Ranch hands passing through the ridge said the hollow had reopened, smaller but visible again. The soil around it cracked in rings like a dried lake bed. They claimed to hear the faint ticking of picks, sometimes 12 at a time. Others described the light of lanterns far below, moving in patterns, as though a work crew continued its task. The Lander Chronicle published one brief mention that summer under the heading, "Old Silver Mine Stirs Again." It compared the account to the early South Pass collapses and suggested unstable gas or underground water might be the cause of breathing earth. But readers noticed a small discrepancy. The paper's own map placed the supposed disturbance directly over the old coordinates of Raven's Hollow, long thought erased. By autumn, another landslide sealed the valley entirely. Heavy rains transformed the depression into a shallow pond, later known among locals as Miners' Rest Lake. Children were told not to swim there because the water pulls. In the following decade, the hollow was absent from public record, but a handful of letters from a Fremont County archivist suggest state geologists still debated the site quietly. One 1908 note reads, "Residual warmth detected near basin floor. No geothermal vent visible. Possibly decomposing ore or other matter." The tone is clinical, yet the phrasing, other matter, leaves too much to imagine. And so, by the dawn of a new century, Raven's Hollow no longer appeared in ledgers or maps. But those who lived nearby knew better. Some silences, they said, are not the absence of sound, only the pause before it starts again. The years passed quietly, yet the hollow refused complete extinction. Around 1909, a group of university researchers from Laramie conducted fieldwork in the Sweetwater Basin, focusing on soil composition and residual mining deposits. Among their papers is a short report marked Confidential, Acoustic Survey. It references a low-frequency vibration emanating from below the West Ridge Depression, measured intermittently for 3 days. No seismic activity was recorded elsewhere in the region. The lead researcher, Professor Albert Wren, wrote in his notebook, "Tone sustained and rhythmic, repeating at intervals of 6 seconds. No surface source identified. Soil cool, though temperature readings suggest mild internal flux." Wren and his team abandoned the site abruptly after a storm on the 3rd night. His later correspondence with the State Geological Office dismissed the anomaly as an instrument malfunction due to pressure imbalance. Yet, within his private journal, preserved by his granddaughter decades later, he admitted, "The pressure changed only when we approached the center. I am certain something beneath was moving. Slow, deliberate, vast." That same winter, a hunter named Louis Terran claimed to have fallen through thin ice near Miners Rest Lake. He survived, but reported that the water pulled like a tide, and that beneath the surface he saw the glow of lamps, steady as stars. Locals dismissed his story, though he refused to return to the ridge again. In 1910, state surveyors revisited the site for the first time in nearly 2 decades, part of a wider effort to remap old mining lands. The foreman of the expedition, Captain Wilkes, described the basin as unnaturally symmetrical, almost circular, its soil fine as ash. When digging to test depth, they struck timber just 2 feet below the surface, beams preserved by mineral residue with nails that shone faintly even under dirt. "The men refused to touch the wood," Wilkes wrote. "They said it sounded hollow when stepped upon, as though there was another floor beneath." His official report concluded that the site was geologically unstable, unsuitable for reclamation, but a private addendum found years later adds a final line. "The echo of our own shovels came back with delay, not once, but twice, as though there were 2 depths of earth beneath us." By then, the story of Raven's Hollow had become a local myth, a cautionary tale told to travelers at the taverns of South Pass City. Many believed it an exaggeration of real events, others a ghost story meant to dissuade prospectors from trespassing. Yet there remained those who swore they had seen the lights, heard the hammering, or felt the ground shift beneath their horses. Among the miners' descendants, a peculiar superstition survived. When passing near the old ridge, one was to leave a coin pressed into the soil, payment for silence, as they called it. Some did so even into the 1920s, though no one could say why the practice began. Perhaps it was fear or respect, or perhaps, just perhaps, they sensed the hollow still listening. By 1911, the state of Wyoming was entering a modern age. Electric lights, paved roads, and surveyors armed with instruments more advanced than any the miners of 1879 could have imagined. Yet, beneath all this progress, one anomaly continued to vex local officials. The Sweetwater Ridge remained off-limits, marked in records as non-arable, unstable ground. No one was officially told why, but rumors persisted that the earth there refuses to settle. That same year, a prospector from Utah named Marcus Dyer arrived in South Pass City, seeking forgotten claims from the early silver rush. His field notes, later recovered from his personal effects, show that he had traced several defunct sites and pinpointed a location where the maps fail. Dyer's last entry, dated September 3rd, reads, "Located depression where soil rings when struck. Sound hollow. Will dig shallow test trench tomorrow." He was never seen again. A month later, a patrol from the nearby railway construction crew found his tent half collapsed near Miners Rest Lake. His tools remained, but no body was ever recovered. Curiously, The fire pit beside the tent still glowed faintly despite recent rain, as if heat had seeped upward from the ground rather than down from the flame. Newspapers refused to print the incident, though an internal memo between state surveyors later surfaced. It mentioned the Dyer event, and noted that soil samples taken from the site contained unusual silver dust suspended in clay, luminous under lamplight. That file, too, went missing. Around this same period, an elderly woman living near Atlantic City, Ellen Voss, the widow who once described the ground changing shape after the collapse, sent a letter to the Lander Historical Society. In it, she wrote that she could still hear faint clanging on windless nights and that, sometimes it sounds like counting. She enclosed a map sketch, head by hand, marking the hollow's approximate position with the number 12. She died 2 weeks later. When archivist Walter Sims catalogued her papers, he noted a strange discoloration on the envelope. Gray dust, fine and metallic, unlike anything from the local soil. The map itself was later lost in a 1912 fire that destroyed the Society's storage room. Only Sims's summary remains. Meanwhile, State Engineer Harold Whitcomb revisited the official geological surveys of the Sweetwater Basin that year. In his final report, he cited parallels to older mines near South Pass City, remarking that certain collapsed shafts show structural symmetry inconsistent with natural cave-ins. He mentioned Raven's Hollow by name once, then crossed it out in pencil, replacing it with unverified site number 39. That single phrase, scrawled in the margins, would become the last official recognition of the hollow's existence. But unofficially, whispers grew darker. Rail workers claimed to hear knocks beneath the soil when laying track along the Sweetwater corridor. Camp hands spoke of seeing faint light moving under frozen puddles at night, as if a lantern swung miles below. And when storms rolled across the ridge that winter, locals said the wind no longer howled, it breathed. By 1913, the area once known as Raven's Hollow had become a kind of unspoken borderland, not fenced, yet avoided. Survey lines curved neatly around it, maps shaded its boundaries with indistinct gray, and local guides refused to pass through it after dusk. The Sweetwater winds carried fine dust that glimmered faintly at sunrise, and settlers said it came from the ridge, as though the mountain was still grinding its own bones. That spring, a small scientific team from the University of Chicago's Department of Geology visited Wyoming to study mineral drift. One of their researchers, Dr. Lionel Crane, recorded atmospheric irregularities in the valley air. In calm conditions, the pressure fluctuates in subtle rhythm, like the rise and fall of lungs. Instruments register movement even when the wind is still. He noted that the effect intensified near the depression's center, the same hollow once mapped in the late 1800s. His assistant, Miss Clara Dean, wrote in her personal diary that their tent canvas twitched at night as if grasped from below. Crane dismissed her fear as nerves. On the third day, their barometer shattered without visible cause. The team left the ridge by morning. Crane's official report to the university described the event as a rare thermal oscillation caused by mineral heat pockets. But his handwritten field note, preserved among his private letters, contradicts that tidy explanation. The ground beneath us is not dead. It exhales warmth and sound like a sleeping beast. Meanwhile, locals continued to treat the ridge as a haunted relic of the mining era. In taverns of South Pass City, men told stories of Dorn's crew still working beneath the soil, earning their last wage, never paid. Others believed the mine had pierced an underground spring of gas or air that breathed through fissures, creating the illusion of life. Whatever the truth, and the hollow's silence was never complete. In early winter of that year, a mail carrier traveling through the Sweetwater route vanished during a blizzard. His sled and dogs were found weeks later half buried in snow near Miners Rest Lake. The animals were alive but wild-eyed, their paws burned by something chemical in the ice. The carrier's mailbag was recovered intact. Among the letters was a package wrapped in oiled paper addressed to Wyoming Silver Coal Company. Inside were small vials of gray dust, samples from Site 39. The courier's last unsent note, scribbled hastily on the back of a delivery manifest, read, "Thought I heard the sound of bells below the ice. steady, and close. When state authorities examined the vials, they determined the material to be pulverized ore with trace mercury content. Dangerous, but not supernatural. The samples were sealed in glass and stored in a Lander evidence chest. In 1921, that chest went missing. For decades after, the hollow faded once more into rumor, surviving only through scattered letters and lost archives. Yet some patterns persisted: the measured rhythm, the luminous dust, the faint knocking that seemed to count its own years. By 1915, the ridge was quiet again, at least above ground. But for those who listened closely, especially on cold nights, the silence between the wind carried something else. Not a sound. A pulse. The First World War came and went, and though Wyoming changed with the rest of the nation, the hollow remained untouched, hidden beneath shifting soil and new maps that called it Sweetwater Depression No. 3. By 1916, the mining towns that once fed off South Pass City were nearly extinct, their streets filled with silence and the occasional echo of wind through empty store frames. But that same year, an odd discovery brought the hollow's name back into conversation for the first time in decades. During a dry summer, Miners' Rest Lake receded nearly 6 feet, exposing part of the original shaft timbering below the surface. A ranch hand named George Whitaker, who had gone to fetch water, reported seeing a ring of posts and iron fittings like ribs of a wheel. When he tapped one with his shovel, the sound echoed hollow, deep, and metallic. The county surveyor, E.J. Hollis, was dispatched to inspect the site. His report remains one of the few modern documents referencing the hollow by name. Visible remains of shaft structure confirmed, coordinates align with previous reports concerning Raven's Hollow site. Subterranean cavity persists, though depth indeterminable. Air movement detected, though water present. Recommendation: reseal immediately. Hollis noted something else, scribbled faintly at the bottom margin, likely for his own recollection, not for public record. The echo was delayed, nearly 2 seconds, yet returned clearer than the first strike. Locals claimed that after the inspection, the lake level rose inexplicably overnight, flooding the exposed posts once more. Hollis's assistant later told neighbors that the water boiled without heat, and that the surface had rippled inward, as if drawn toward a single, unseen point. Over the following years, storms and snow refilled the depression. The hollow disappeared again beneath ice and time. Yet a pattern emerged. Every few decades, whenever the ground dried too much or water receded too far, the mine would reappear, just long enough for someone to look, listen, and leave. In 1918, near the close of the war, a telegram surfaced in the archives of the Wyoming Historical Office, sent from a retired engineer to the state governor. It read simply, "Do not reopen hollow, not gas, not flood. Structure continues. Workers remain." The signature at the bottom was smudged, but analysts later compared it to early handwriting samples from Elias Dorn. Whether a hoax or something more, the telegram reignited whispers across the frontier. Veterans returning from Europe spoke of dreams featuring hammering under stone and faces in walls. Miners who had never even been to the region claimed to wake at night to the sound of measured strikes, 12 at a time, echoing faintly through their walls. By the dawn of 1919, the last known official mention of the hollow appeared in an engineering memo discussing abandoned mining sites. The author concluded, almost in resignation, "The Raven's Hollow collapse remains unsolved, though its effect on the local geology endures. Perhaps it was not men who were buried, but the air itself, trapped and alive." After that, the record falls silent again. But even silence, as Wyoming had long learned, carries its own kind of breath. By 1920, most who had lived through the old mining years were gone. Raven's Hollow had become a ghost of a story, a warning told beside campfires, its details softened by decades of retelling. Yet that winter, a young historian from Cheyenne named Clara Winthrop began collecting accounts of lost mines of the frontier. Her project was academic, But what she found in Fremont County pulled her into something older, stranger, and unfinished. Among the courthouse storage shelves, Winthrop discovered a thin folder labeled "Abandoned Property, Unfit for Entry." Inside were the remnants of reports from 1879 to 1915, ledgers, maps, and torn telegrams, all referencing a single site whose coordinates had been erased with black ink. In the margin of one letter, written decades earlier by a surveyor named Redden, she saw the faintest imprint of the words "Raven's Hollow." She began piecing together the fragments, noting patterns that repeated across time: warmth beneath snow, delayed echoes, the number 12, the recurring name, E. Dorn. In her notes, she compared the phenomenon to the early collapses of South Pass City, where miners often reported acoustic distortions in the earth before major cave-ins. But this, she wrote, feels less like warning and more like persistence. In one archived letter, a witness from 1885 described seeing a man standing near the sealed shaft at dusk, pale, bareheaded, his clothes stiff with frost, though he did not seem to breathe. The letter's author identified the man as Dorn, though no evidence placed him alive past 1879. Still, Winthrop recorded it with care, writing in the margin, possibly apocryphal, yet repeated by 4 sources. When she visited the area herself that summer, she found only a shallow basin, wind-swept and colorless. The lake was half-drained, leaving behind a crust of silver-gray clay that shimmered faintly at dawn. She took samples, noting the odd texture, neither sand nor silt, but something finer, almost like ash. Winthrop camped 2 nights near the site. Her surviving field notes grow erratic toward the end. The first entry reads calm and methodical. No visual anomalies, soil dense, temperature 1 degree warmer near center depression. The second is shorter. Heard tapping after dark. 12 strikes, evenly spaced. Maybe water expansion in rock. The third and final note, written in hurried, slanted ink. It answered when I struck back. Winthrop returned to Cheyenne and submitted her report to the State University under the title An Inquiry into the Echo Phenomena of the Sweetwater Region. The paper was never published. Her editor deemed it too atmospheric, insufficiently scientific. But tucked inside the back cover of her manuscript was a photograph, the only known modern image of the site. It showed the depression at sunset, barren except for one narrow shaft, half covered by reeds and shadow. At the bottom of the photograph, in her handwriting, a caption reads, "Raven's Hollow, still breathing." Winthrop never abandoned the hollow entirely. Letters found among her possessions, dated between 1921 and 1925, reveal her quiet obsession with the site. She wrote to geologists, archivists, even the descendants of miners from South Pass City, hoping to find anyone who could confirm the events of 1879. Most replies were brief or dismissive. Some, however, hinted at knowledge deliberately left unspoken. One correspondent, Harold Whitcomb, the same state engineer who once renamed the mine Unverified Site Number 39, wrote her a single cryptic line: "If you value your sleep, Miss Winthrop, do not listen too closely when the ground is quiet." In the following years, Winthrop's work became increasingly solitary. She spoke rarely, though neighbors recalled her pacing the porch at night, pressing an old stethoscope to the soil of her garden, as if listening for something deep below. Her final public lecture in 1923 drew only a handful of students. The topic was Human Acoustics and the Memory of Stone. Those who attended described her tone as calm, detached, but with a strange certainty when she spoke of the hollow. "There are sounds," she said, "that are not echoes at all, but continuations, a labor resumed each night beneath us." The transcript ends there, mid-sentence, interrupted by laughter in the hall. She never completed her presentation. By 1924, the hollow had reclaimed its isolation. The ridge had eroded further, and Miners Rest Lake, fed by snowmelt, covered most of the depression again. Hunters and travelers reported that the water shimmered like metal under the sun, and that no birds ever landed on its surface. That same winter, an earthquake struck western Wyoming, minor by official accounts, yet its epicenter aligned directly with the Sweetwater Basin. Locals said the tremor felt less like a jolt and more like a breath drawn inward. For weeks after Daz, Road, the air carried a faint sulfuric tang, and the ground near the ridge steamed through thin cracks in the snow. A railroad worker named Caleb Baird, passing through the area with a maintenance crew, wrote home that the men had seen light moving under the frost, like lanterns fading deep below the ice. His letter ends with a curious phrase. "They're still at it, Ma. Same as before, still digging." No one could say how he would have known. When Winthrop's estate was catalogued after her death in 1925, officials discovered a box labeled Raven's Hollow, Personal Notes. Inside were drafts of unfinished essays, geological sketches, and a single metal fragment about the size of a coin, circular, warped, faintly silver. It bore 12 shallow indentations around its edge. Pinned beside it was a handwritten card in her delicate script. Sample retrieved at dawn, January 14th. Sound resumed precisely 6 minutes later. The curator who examined the box later wrote in the accession ledger that the fragment was unusually warm to the touch, despite having sat in storage overnight. It was filed under unclassified mineral object and stored deep in the museum vaults. No record shows it was ever studied again. When the century turned and memory began to thin, Raven's Hollow passed into something quieter than history. By the 1930s, only a few weathered locals still spoke its name, and even they did so reluctantly, lowering their voices as though the valley itself might overhear. Miner's Rest. Lake had swallowed the last traces of the shaft, its waters reflecting the sky like a dark mirror. In 1931, a state conservation project briefly considered draining the basin for irrigation. The proposal was abandoned when the first drill test struck empty air at a depth of 60 feet, followed by what witnesses described as a single, hollow note that rang longer than any echo. The workmen left their rig half-standing and refused to return. One of them, Thomas Greaves, later told a journalist from Lander that he had felt the ground breathing beneath his boots. When asked to clarify, he hesitated before saying, "It was like standing on a lung too large to see." After that, no one tried to reopen the site again. Official maps replaced the area with blank shading, a convenient nothingness. The state labeled it private watershed, and the public forgot it existed. Yet not all silences endure. In 1947, a university archivist rediscovered Clara Winthrop's unfinished manuscript in a box of damaged papers. Her notes were brittle but legible. The ink faded into pale brown veins. The archivist restored a few pages and found her last line, written in a steady hand despite its haunting words. What they uncovered was never a mine. It was an opening. That discovery reignited brief academic interest, but no one returned to verify it. The site, remote and unprofitable, was soon buried under new layers of regulation, paperwork, and polite indifference. Still, among residents of South Pass City and the nearby Sweetwater Ranch lands, the old warning survived. Travelers who crossed the basin at dusk spoke of feeling their wagon wheels drag, as if the soil itself resisted. Campers near the lake reported hearing faint tapping under the water, 12 strokes, then stillness. And on certain winter nights, when the wind was thin and the moon low, the air carried a deep, metallic hum that seemed to rise from below, echoing through the ridges until even the snow vibrated. No records remain of Elias Dorn or his crew beyond those scattered fragments. Whether he survived, vanished, or was simply consumed by his own excavation, no one could ever say. But the line scrawled in the constable's report back in 1880 still lingers like a final breath between fact and myth. Bodies interred by force of earth, faces preserved as if caught in fright. And perhaps that is the hollow's truest secret, not the cause of its collapse, nor the fate of its men, but the idea that some work never ends. Even now, more than a century later, the wind above Sweetwater Ridge moves in long, deliberate sighs. Locals claim that if you stand there alone, You can feel the faint rhythm beneath your feet, steady, patient, and far below, as though the mind still remembers its crew. And if you listen long enough, you might hear them counting. 1, 2, 3, 12. Always 12.